Hello, my name is Monika Zdanaviciute. I'm from Vytautas Magnus University, and together with colleagues from Thomas More University of Applied Science, we present you big data analysis for intangible cultural heritage, tourism, storytelling. I'm starting with part A, and my colleagues will continue in part B. I'll carry more of a technical aspects of data analysis, while while in part B, storytelling part will be explained. I'm going to talk about the data, uh, how to prepare it, and what methods can be used to analyze this kind of data. And of course, I'll show you the analysis. In order to tell something about cultural tourism, we needed to find data that we can analyze and tell a story from. So in our case, we decided to analyze two datasets by combining them into one. One of them describes the situation of intangible cultural heritage in the country, and the other, the scale of tourism in the country. This first dataset, which describes ICH, is taken from UNESCO, and it consists of 128 countries, 13 years period of time, and 562 different ICH elements, and some of them are registered in several countries. So basically, this data shows us what ICH elements are assigned to the countries, in which year is registered, and what are those elements' primary concepts. For example, traditional Mauritanian Sega could be described by concepts like dance or instrumental music. Second data set that we have chosen for this analysis shows number of arrivals in each country every year. Data consists of 218 countries and 25 years interval. This data set is taken from World Tourism Organization. In order to combine two different data sets, we had to unify countries' names in both data sets, because, for example, in one country is named Moldova and in another Republic of Moldova. Then we had to deal with missing data in tourism data set, because as we can see in this picture, where missing data is marked black color, that a lot of countries haven't collected this data earlier. Some of them have missing parts in the middle or at the end of time interval. And about half of the countries haven't collected tourism data in 2020s, probably because of the COVID. So we had to drop this data. In order to understand whether any specific group of ICH elements is related to tourism, we decided to divide the elements into 5 groups. So first of all, we took unique primary concepts list, and assigned the concepts with one or more groups. For example, concept dance goes to group dance, instrumental music to the group music, and beverages is assigned to food. Then each element is assigned to one or more types based on its primary concepts. So, for example, traditional Mauritanian Sega is assigned to music and dance intangible cultural heritage types. Then a summary is made where we can see how many ICH elements the country has in total and how many different types of ICH elements it has. Also, the table below shows the total number of elements of each type in the dataset. The largest group of ICH elements is music and events, and the smallest is food. Now we can finally combine those two datasets into one. And now United Dataset consists of 103 countries, from 2008 to 2019. The rows are different countries, and in columns we have number of total ICH elements, number of specific ICH elements, tourist arrivals in a country every year, and change in tourists in different time intervals. So for example, a column named from 2008 to 2019 shows the difference of tourist arrivals between these 2 years. So we can see that Albania and Algeria tourist numbers increased in that time interval, while Andorra's tourist numbers decreased. To find out whether tourists flows in countries are related to cultural heritage in those countries, we measure the correlation between two relevant variables. In this case, Pearson correlation coefficient is used to measure the strength of the linear relationship between two variables, and a t-test is performed to determine if a correlation is statistically significant. Correlation coefficient always range from -1 to 1, and if coefficient value is -1, it describes perfect negative correlation. If value is 1, it shows perfect positive correlation. And when coefficient value is close to 0, the correlation is weak. First of all, we are looking into correlation between number of intangible cultural heritage and number of tourists every year. As we can see, the correlation values vary between 0.56 and 0.62 in different years. Such a value of the correlation coefficient shows that there is a positive relationship between number of ICH and the number of tourists. Then our second step was to find out whether there is a relationship between ICH elements in the country and the change in tourist flows in 5 different time intervals. As we can see, correlation coefficient values range from 0.59 to 0.69. So we can say that the increase or decrease in tourist flows has positive correlation with number of ICH in the country. After analyzing total numbers of ICH elements in the countries, we decided to see if specific type of cultural heritage has relation with number of tourists. As we can see from this table, strongest correlation is observed between events ICH and tourists, then music ICH and tourists, and the weakest correlation is observed with dance type ICH elements. This may also be related to number of ICH elements described in different groups. For example, there are more event ICH elements than food. One more thing that we wanted to measure is the correlation coefficient between different ICH element types and the change of number of tourists in different time intervals. Similar as in the previous slide, some ICH types correlation with the tourist flows change is higher than the other types. So that was all from me. I invite you to listen to the second part of this webinar, where my colleagues from Thomas More University of Applied Science will continue on these results interpretation and storytelling. Thank you.
Welcome everyone, welcome to the webinar on Big Data Analysis for Intangible Cultural Heritage Tourism Storytelling, Part B. My colleague, Dr. Marco Scholtz, and I, Kaat, we are both researchers and also lecturers innovative tourism at the Thomas More University of Applied Sciences. And today we have the honor of guiding you through the results of the analysis presented in the first part of this webinar, presented by Monika. And of course, it tackles the datasets of both UNESCO Dive into Intangible Cultural Heritage and the UNWTO Tourist Arrivals or Tourism Dashboards. Now, this webinar builds on the insights that were already provided in earlier webinars, webinars that covered an introduction of the concept of intangible cultural heritage and also the role of big data in tourism and storytelling. Make sure to check these webinars out first so that we can take our exploration regarding intangible cultural heritage, tourism, big data, and storytelling to the next level. Once you did that, then we're all ready to go and we're ready to tackle today's agenda that is structured around 3 key questions. So the first question is, can intangible cultural heritage be leveraged for tourism purposes? And there we'll have a look at the contextualization of the big data analysis from part A. A second topic that we're going to address is the question, what can proper storytelling actually improve? What are the effects of a lack of storytelling? And a third question is, what story can be told about intangible cultural heritage and its place in tourism? So we're going to have a look at the big data analysis results, but shared through storytelling.
Thank you, Kaat. So we quickly look at the results of the analyses that were done in part A. And the analyses that were done included only correlation analysis because we wanted to see to what extent the data from the 2 data sets actually correlate with one another. So the first thing that we looked at was the number of intangible cultural heritage activities or practices versus the number of tourists between 2008 and 2019. When you look at the graph and the table at the bottom, on the graph on the right, you'll see that at the top of the graph is a +1, and it's in a dark blue color. And as you move down the graph to the 0, it's a white. And when you go to the -1, it's a dark red. While the +1 or -1 indicates whether the correlations between the 2 data sets were either positive or negative. And if it's a positive correlation, it means that if one data set's numbers continue to rise, then also the other data set's numbers rose. And when looking at the figure or at the graph, the closer you go to the 1, the stronger the correlation is. So if it's a correlation of 0, it means that there's actually just no correlation at all. So the closer you go then from there to 1, the stronger the correlation is. It means that the data worked in a similar way. And if you go to the -1, it means that the data works in different ways. If one data set goes up, the other one goes down. And when looking at the table, then you can see from 2008, there was a correlation of 0.57. It's a very medium type of correlation. But as the years went on, you can see it went all the way up to 0.62. And what this tells us is that the ICH activities or practices, as they increased, or the number of registered activities increased, so that the tourist numbers also over the years. It doesn't necessarily mean that the one influenced the other, but that it's still something that indicates to us that something might have happened between these 2 that could have increased the growth between them. Next slide. So the second one that we looked at was the number of ICH activities or practices versus the change in number of tourists. So when you look at the table below, you'll see we looked at the change between 2008 and 2019, then 2010 and 2019, all the way up to 2016 and 2019. And you can see in the more recent years, between 2014 and 2019 and 2016 and 2019, there was a correlation of 0.69 for both years. It means that the number of ICH activities increased quite a lot, and was also similar to the changes and the number of visitors during these years, which also shows that ICH activities and tourist numbers grew strongly and did so more significantly as the years progressed. Then the third one, types of ICH activities or practices versus the number of tourists from 2008 to 2019. So here, the different types of ICH, according to the data sets, were categorized into different terminologies. These are not necessarily the terminologies used by UNESCO, but this is how the data turned out. So we have music, ICH, dance, spiritual, events, and food. And when looking at the table, you can instantly see that events ICH is a darker blue, meaning that it's already more positive. It's a stronger type of correlation between the visitor numbers and events. So by 2019, events had the strongest correlation. And that's followed by music ICH with 0.42 correlation. And although they're not necessarily directly related, it could mean that an increase in music and event ICH could lead to an increase in visitor numbers. Dance and food ICH had smaller correlations, but these correlation significances also continually grew throughout the years, even though it was quite slow. And for spiritual ICH, it was the smallest growth. It didn't really increase much over the years. So it has the smallest correlation with tourist numbers. Then the types of ICH activities or practices versus the number of tourists from 2008 to 2019. So we're also, like in the second analysis, looking at the change in tourist numbers between the 2 years. And here it's also clear that music ICH and events ICH had some of the biggest changes, but here music had the biggest change or biggest correlation between 2014 and 2019, and also between 2016 and 2019. Yeah, so it's clear that it's mostly in more recent years that these played a very significant role. And you might have noticed, especially if you are not an expert on statistics, or if you do not understand the lingo of statistics, if you're, for instance, a manager or a marketeer of a specific company, that you might not fully understand the data that was just read to you. Perhaps you wouldn't be able to understand it if just looking at it without any clarification. And that's because there's a lack of storytelling. And there's a few things that takes place when there's a lack of storytelling in data. The first thing is that it takes more time to understand it. The purpose of the analysis isn't always immediately clear. You might not be interested in something for long enough to actually listen to kind of understand it. And you might not really understand the meaning of what's being conveyed to you. Then also statistical knowledge. If you do not have great statistical knowledge, like a lot of people do not, it doesn't mean that you need it if you don't work with it. It's just difficult to understand the data that's being shown to you. Then also data sets without storytelling needs increased interpretation and explanation. So you need to add more text, you need to speak for longer. People find it irritating, and there's a possibility of leaving out key pieces of information that other people might need if they do not understand statistics very well. Then it can also lead to inaccurate conclusions. So the speaker or the person writing the text might try to portray a certain image or story to you without using too much of storytelling. And you might understand it differently. So you don't see the correct pattern that's being shown. You might not hear the correct terminologies and understand it correctly. And this can be detrimental to businesses, because you might listen to a specific speech or see something written somewhere and make business decisions from this. And this could lead to poor outcomes. But there are also better ways of working with data. And that's by adding a type of story to it and making it more comfortable for people to understand. And my colleague Kaat will explain this part.
Yes, thank you very much, Marco. So let's have a look at all of these results through a visual storytelling lens. So from this slide, it immediately becomes clear that both the number of listed intangible cultural heritage practices and visitor numbers grew together over time, starting from 2008, the year in which the representative list of the Intangible Cultural Heritage of Humanity was established. And on average, each year, 38 practices are added to those lists of the 2003 Convention of UNESCO on Intangible Cultural Heritage. Now, although both of them grew together over time, as mentioned before, this does not necessarily imply that the inscription of intangible cultural heritage practices on the list resulted in an increase in tourist arrivals or vice versa. However, this does provide us actually with a direction for further research, for further investigation, the opportunity to carry out research to unravel whether these two elements, intangible cultural heritage practices and tourist arrivals, are indeed influenced by one another. So this could lead to posing research questions such as what is the potential influence of elements of intangible cultural heritage on the tourism offering, and following from that, the influx of tourists. Now, the relevance of intangible cultural heritage types to visitor numbers. If we delve a bit deeper, we notice that the concept of intangible cultural heritage is actually rather a collective term containing various types of intangible cultural heritage, as seen in the introductory webinar on ICH. Now, within this analysis, relating concepts have been grouped, resulting in 5 main types of intangible cultural heritage that are correlated with the number of visitors. And as Marco mentioned before, these types are intangible cultural heritage related to music, to dance, spiritual, also food or gastronomy, and events. Now, it becomes clear that over time, aspects such as events, later on music, are the most strongly correlated with the visitor numbers. But also, of course, a country's food or gastronomy shows to some extent a correlation with these numbers. Although this does not necessarily show a direct relation, it could as well be that, for example, over a certain amount of time, when the amount of visitors to countries grew because of some other tourism offerings, and ICH practices of these types were added to those lists. That's possible as well. But this could mean actually that elements such as events, such as music and food, they are indeed interesting practices of ICH that could be attractive to visitors, and in other words, be marketed as pull factors of destinations. Practice has shown us actually that these ICH practices are indeed interesting to tourism for multiple reasons, often because they are accessible to the general public. Think about the many carnivals, think about musical performances. While those spiritual practices, they could be of a more private or enclosed character and not really accessible to visitors. Now, of course, future research is required to examine whether there is indeed a causal relationship between these types of intangible cultural heritage practices and visitor numbers, and to what extent, of course, because it is in that case also very important to make sure that these practices are dealt with in a sustainable way within a tourism context, and that tourism functions indeed as a platform for the safeguarding of these very valuable elements. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.